All right. In a few minutes, the polls will be closing in Massachusetts. So, why don't we talk a little bit about it? The highlight of the night is probably going to be Ed Markey versus Joe Kennedy. Now, for those of you who have not been following this, Joe Kennedy has essentially been spending the past year running against Senator Ed Markey, and it's really developed into an interesting dynamic whereby the establishment candidate is the challenger, Joe Kennedy, because of the last name, and the progressive insurgent is actually the incumbent. But Ed Markey has, for a while, been positioning himself as a progressive, particularly on climate change. So it'll be fascinating to see where this goes, because conventional wisdom just a month ago and for most of this year was that Markey was in danger to losing to Kennedy. Now it seems like it's very much gone the other way, and it looks like that Markey is going to survive this. So it'll be really interesting to see how exactly this race plays out and where exactly each candidate has their base of support. Further down the ballot are two House races, or three House races that have competitive primaries. Massachusetts 1, incumbent Richard Neal faces a challenge from Holyoke Mayor Alex Morse. In Massachusetts 8, Stephen Lynch faces a challenge from Robbie Goldstein. And while most people think that Richard Neal is the more endangered incumbent, I personally think it's going to be Stephen Lynch for a number of reasons, including the fact that he's left this race unattended to. The polls show the race close, and that performance at Louis DeJoy's hearing really sounded like desperation. It seemed like he really saw something in his internal polling that wasn't good. And so that's the incumbent who I think is going to be the one to watch to see if he goes down. Not Markey, not Neal, but Lynch. And in Massachusetts 4, there are a number of candidates who are running, and it's a real scramble. And it really does look like there's no clear favorite. I'd be surprised if any candidate got above 20%, to be very honest. And there's a number of candidates who are running, and I'll see if I can give a brief overview of the candidates in this race. And I give credit to RRH Elections for preparing this overview, because it really helps to document who is running and where they stand. Jake Auchincloss was really considered to be the front runner for this district, but he's gotten to a bit of hot water for his support for his past support for high school students who displayed the Confederate flag. There is Zane Leckie, who's running as a progressive, is probably the most left-wing candidate in this district, and she's endorsed by Ilhan Omar. Jessie actually appears to be the new frontrunner, and she's endorsed by Ayanna Pressley, and she's really emerged as what I think is a growing bloc in Congress called pro-Israel progressives. This includes Ayanna Pressley herself. It also includes Richie Torres, who's going to be elected to Congress is going to be in Congress this coming year. And if Jessie Mermel also wins this, she will very much be part of that bloc. Another candidate to look forward to in the future who did not win, but who I'd say could be someone to watch for in the coming years, would very much be in Illinois. I'll try to remember who her name is, but in a district in Illinois, Danny Davis faced a challenge from, yes, Christine Schanbacher. It's amazing what you remember once you actually go through the information. Anyway, she will be someone to watch when and if Danny Davis retires, but she would also be part of this block of pro-Israel progressives. In fact, she even attacked Danny Davis on this very issue because of Danny Davis's ties to Louis Farrakhan. So the polls are going to close in just a few minutes. I'm not necessarily going to stay for all of the results to come in, but I just wanted to give that very brief overview. There is one more incumbent who faces a challenge, Seth Moulton. He actually faces two challengers, and for a number of reasons, he really isn't the best fit for the Democratic Party in this day and age, but he doesn't seem like he's vulnerable at all. If he goes down in defeat, that would be really surprising. And so I personally think Stephen Lynch will be the candidate to watch in Massachusetts 8th, rather than any of the other incumbents that we have discussed so far. Let's talk about a number of other topics I want to talk about just before the polls close, and while we wait for results. We have by now everyone has probably heard about the protests in Kenosha and the horrific events that took place there. And it really does feel like, if you're an outside observer, it feels like you're being squeezed between two extremes. You have people who are calling for defunding the police, and who are saying that rioting is as legitimate as protesting. And on the other hand, you will have people who are making the shooter out to be a hero, and it feels like you're stuck between. And if you want a great example of that, take what Jesse Kelly said when he referred to the two people that he murdered as, quote, pelts on the wall. I mean, how pro-life is that? And so it can really feel like you're being stuck between two extremes. And I really think that there really needs to be a middle ground that acknowledges, yes, African Americans have faced mistreatment by police officers, but no, we shouldn't defund the police. We need the police. In fact, do you know which communities need the police the most? African Americans. In fact, African Americans agree with this. Polls have actually shown that 61% of African Americans want the same amount of police presence in their neighborhood as they do now. They believe that, but overwhelmingly, that there should be reforms, and yes, there should be. We need to, for example, end a big thing that would help to end many of these incidents would be to end qualified immunity, which does not serve the purpose it serves. It has just helped to shield police officers from misconduct. So yes, things need to be fixed, but throwing the baby out with the bathwater is not the right way to go. And I think that most Americans, regardless of race, agree with me on that. Anyway, the conventions took place the past 2 weeks. Now, what you may not have heard about is a group of conservatives and people from across the political spectrum coming together to create the Convention on Founding Principles, where a middle ground was put forward between the two extremes. Well, most people in the convention are going to be supporting Biden. They've really helped to put forward what I think is going to be the future of conservatism if conservatism wants to survive. And one of the things that was talked about, David Jolly actually talked about this in his speech, was voting, and the idea that Republicans should aim to expand their appeal, not narrow who can vote. And it's actually on this very topic that a number of states are holding referendums. We've talked about referendums in a previous episode, but this time I want to talk about the issue of voting. As we wait for results to come in, I would like to talk about a number of voting changes that people are going to be potentially voting, people will be voting on. In California, there is a measure on the ballot that would restore the voting rights to convicted felons who have served their prison sentence and are on parole. And I can tell you that my personal view has always been that once a person has repaid their debt to society, they should get their right to vote back. You actually have states like Kentucky and Iowa and formerly Florida, where if you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote for life unless the governor chooses to restore your voting rights. In Florida, they actually passed an amendment a couple of years ago to make the restoration process automatic. And in Iowa and Kentucky, the governors have actually restored the voting rights of hundreds of thousands of convicted felons. And these have helped to expand the reach expand the electorate and basically make it so both parties have to expand their appeal. I think that this is something that Republicans should want to do. Now, I do, however, think that just as we want to make sure that those who have the right to vote can, we should also make sure that those who don't have the right to vote cannot. Alabama, Colorado, and Florida are voting on measures that would basically say that only citizens can vote. This would change their constitutions effectively. It's a symbolic measure, but I do believe that it is nevertheless important. But there are other measures that we could be pursuing. I, for example, do support the idea of a photo ID requirement to vote, but I also support the idea of making it as easy as possible to obtain voter ID. And you have a state like Texas, which I think goes too far in the sense that they specifically carve out student IDs and say that it does not qualify as valid ID to vote, but they also say that a driver's license and a military ID are valid, but again, a student ID is not. That to me seems like it's narrowly tailored not to secure elections, but to make it easier for a specific type, not a specific type of people, but people who will vote for who tend to vote for a specific party to come out and vote and make it harder for those who support the other party to do so. That to me does not seem right. But I do support the idea of securing elections, but I also support the idea of making them accessible. And I think that that is what the position that both parties should hold, quite frankly. Missouri is voting on a ballot measure that would extend the 2-term limit requirement to all executive offices. Now, I actually agree with this. I personally like the idea of executive officers being limited to 2 terms, so that they do, as a result, that not one single person, dominates this particular office, and it actually creates for more competitive elections because frequent rotation means that there are more open races, and it means that the office is more accessible to more people. Now, I'm not necessarily supportive of this for legislative elections because this has been tried before, and back, in fact, in the late 18th century. And what it was, and during that time in France, in the late 18th century, members of the Republic legislature were limited to 1 term, and what happened? You had inexperienced people who did not know how to run the legislature, and while that is not necessarily the case today because many states, have multiple terms for legislators. Even then, there are studies that show that polarization actually is worse in states that have term limits. So there are reasons to be skeptical of the idea of term limits for legislators, but for executive officers, I think it really is a great idea. Now, speaking of appealing to a more broader electorate, California has long had a top 2 primary format, and Florida is voting on a measure that would possibly establish that for state officers going forward. And Alaska and North Dakota are voting on a top 4 system whereby all candidates appear on the state ballot earlier in the primary, and then in the general election, it's going to be the top 4 candidates, regardless of party, that are selected through ranked ballots. Now, the idea behind the top 2 primary or top 4 primary format is that if you're competing not just for your party's base but for all voters, then you have to appeal to a broader electorate, and actually incentivizes you to appeal to the middle. Democrats in California hate this system because of the potential for them to be potentially locked out of races that they're not competitive in. But it also has the potential of them being locked out of races that they are competitive in. There's a House seat in California that they flipped 2 years ago, but 2 Republicans actually advanced the general election. I think only one of them is still in the race. And so this seat is definitely going to flip back. But I like the idea of politicians not just having to appeal to their base. The idea that politicians have to appeal to everyone, regardless of what election they're running in, does seem like something that we should support. Now, Oregon might very well be voting on an independent redistricting commission. That is not a guarantee yet. It is not a guarantee that Oregon will be voting on that just yet. There's a pending judicial challenge to that. Virginia, however, will be voting on that. And it really, to say something, for Republicans, this might very well be our best chance at a map that we could be remotely competitive in. Because if this commission doesn't pass, Democrats will be drawing the next district lines in Virginia. Republicans got to draw the lines last time around. This time it's going to be Democrats. So I would think you would want to support an independent commission to at least have the chance that the commission draws lines that are competitive or that are fair. And Democrats often complain about gerrymandering, but the truth is Democrats do it too. Quite notably in Maryland, which has a 7-to-1 map for Democrats. But if you go over to, if you look at what a fair map looks like, there would be a second Republican district in the northwest of the state. That district would also be a Republican district, and at least it would be under a fair map. And you could also argue that in Connecticut, a fair map would have at least one Republican district, and so we see what happens, that both parties draw districts that are meant to entrench their candidates. And I would think that you would want maps that promote competitive elections across the board. And that's why I support the idea of independent commissions, also because the United States is one of the very few countries that actually has politicians draw their own district boundaries. And to me, that does not seem right, that state politicians draw their own boundaries. So I would think that you would want, regardless of party, to have people who are not invested in making laws to draw the lines for lawmakers. To me, anything else would not seem right. Now let's move on to criminal justice. A number of states are going to be voting on this year on something called Marsy's Law, which is essentially a victim's bill of rights. Kentucky is voting on it later this year. Wisconsin voted it on earlier this year, and it passed. And in any state that has voted on Marsy's Law, it has passed. So it really seems like this is a broadly popular measure. California is going to be voting to replace cash bail. And I generally agree with the idea that people should not be held in jail awaiting trial because they're unable to pay. It should be based on whether or not they are a danger to the community. And while I'm very much conservative, I really take my credentials as a small government conservative seriously. And so I really do support the idea of criminal justice reform, because I really do believe that if government is going to house people, it should very much bear the cost of that. Now, I'm going to interrupt this discussion of ballot measures because we do have results. With just about 253 votes in, Ed Markey, has the incumbent for the Senate, has a lead over Joseph Kennedy. That is where things stand right now, and that is honestly very much where I expected things to stand. And we have our first result also from the 1st district, where incumbent Richard Neal has a lead over challenger Alex Morse. It is very much too soon to say where exactly these races are going to go, but these are just some very early results to keep in mind. Ed Markey leads about 58 to 42, and Richard Neal also leads about 57.7 to 42.3%. That is all we know so far, and again, this will continue to be updated as the night continues to go on. I'm not necessarily going to stay for as more results come in. I just want to really talk about what's been on my mind. Michigan is voting to require a search warrant to access electronic data, and I generally do agree with the entirety of the bill, even the Fourth Amendment. I think that the state having the power to search at will without a warrant is not something that we should support, because you might trust one side to have that power, but would you trust the other side to have that power? And if not, then I don't think either side should have that power. Let's talk about, and just before we move on, I really want to say that I really believe, and once again, that conservatives really think about supporting criminal justice reform simply because if we really do believe in small government, we should be consistent about it. We have some more results, and we have something coming in a bit from Lawrence, which I believe is in the northeast of Massachusetts, and Joseph Kennedy is now back in the lead. But again, it is not in. Again, it's not clear where exactly this is going. But again, I'm going to keep an eye on this, and as long as I'm still streaming and I still have stuff to talk about, I'll try to keep everyone updated as the night goes on. On the issue of healthcare, Missouri and Oklahoma both voted on Medicaid expansion, and they both passed by narrower than expected margins. And this is something that we conservatives need to keep in mind, is that in every state that has voted on Medicaid expansion, it has passed. The legislative Republicans might not agree with it, but Republican voters tend to, so a lot of them tend to like it, or at least enough of them that it passes in many of these states. And so we should, we should very much be careful about how we talk about the issue of healthcare, because I think that Biden, really could be putting together a winning coalition on the issue of healthcare. As long as he, maintains his support not for Medicare for all, not for restoring the individual mandate, as long as he avoids those two things, he could put together a coalition that involves support for the idea of a public option, and as well as allowing to negotiate drug prices, and reforms like that could win broad support, if not with lawmakers, then with voters. And that is something that we conservatives should really keep in mind as we talk about the issue of healthcare. On the issue of abortion, I think I have made no secret of my belief in the right to life. But I also believe that before we try to ban abortion, before we try to make it illegal, we should make it unnecessary. Louisiana will be voting on a ballot measure that would say there is no constitutional right to abortion. Colorado would be voting on a ban on abortion after 22 weeks. My guess is that some of these, that the Louisiana measure might pass. The Colorado measure probably won't, though. But again, I think that much of the focus should be on converting over hearts and minds. And I think that once you win the hearts of people, and you convert people to the pro-life side, and you really create the conditions for which abortion is unnecessary, it follows logically that you could easily make it illegal at that point. But I don't think that it would be possible before you do that. We have more results, by the way, from Massachusetts' 1st congressional district. Richard Neal has expanded his lead over Alex Morse. And to me, this is not a surprise. Morse, I think, really fell at the end because of the scandals that broke about him, which may not have turned out to be true, which may turn out to have not been true. But I think that ultimately, this is the kind of district that would support someone like Richard Neal, who's been in politics for a long time, and his base in the Berkshires seemed to really like him, appear to at least to really like him. Sorry, his base in Springfield seems to really be coming through for him. And to be honest, I never really thought this was going to be competitive. I thought that at least it was, but that Richard Neal had a stronger advantage than people thought. Again, I'm really curious to see what's going to happen in Stephen Lynch's district, and I think that's going to be the real surprise of the night. Also, Joseph Kennedy is currently leading by 2% over Ed Markey, and so this is really turning out to be a close race. And one of the things I would probably say at this point is that my guess is that Markey is still favored, but it'll be very interesting to see where this race ends at the end of the night, because for the most of this year, we assumed that Markey was in danger and that he was going to lose to Kennedy. Now it looks like for the first time in over a century, a Kennedy is going to lose a race in what is supposed to be the base of the Kennedy name, Massachusetts. In fact, as I am speaking, Markey has actually retaken the lead and is currently leading Joseph Kennedy by just 27 votes. This is an incredibly close race, and Richard Neal also maintains his lead. I am really excited to see more results come in, because this is the kind of election that election nerds like myself dream of. But returning to the issue, returning to ballot measures, we've talked about marijuana and drugs so far, so I'll come back to those at the end if we have time. But the economy, there's a lot of measures that are potentially going to affect the economy. California could be voting to reclassify app-based drivers as independent contractors. For those of you who do not know, there is a measure that was passed by Democrats in 2019 in California called AB5, and it has wreaked havoc on the state economy. Basically, what it does is that it creates an assumption that people are employees, and if companies want to say that they're independent contractors, it's up to them to prove that they are in fact independent contractors. Now, this has had the effect of causing companies like Uber and Lyft to have their independent contractors reclassified as employees. And while Democrats might have clearly meant well with this, I have seen people in my Twitter feed who have, who've seen their income, slashed as a result of this bill. And I think the Democrats really overplayed their hand on this. And if anything good comes out of this, it might be that if Republicans in California, excuse me, can make this a local election, that could help them. Remember, Michelle Steele is running a really good challenge to Harley Ruda in California's 48th. Young Kim is running a really great challenge to Gil Cisneros in California's 39th. And David Dalladeo is running a really good challenge to Democrat TJ Cox. And Mike Garcia, who is currently a congressman, is running as an incumbent in after a special election that he won. If they can make this election about AB 5, they could really pull out a strong result. Because I don't know anyone in the state who has actually benefited from this bill. And I know a lot of people who have been hurt. The bill actually contains a provision that says that independent writers can, as freelancers, can only write up to 35 articles a year for a given outlet. And to me, that just seems unfair to restrict the amount of work a person is able to do just because they're not part of a union. And this is really what it comes down to me. It really seems like this is all about protecting unions. States that are controlled by Republicans have passed right-to-work laws, so California has gone hard the other way. And I really think that they have thrown the people of California under the bus. And so I just hope that Democrats will recognize that they've overplayed their hand and they'll cut their losses and roll back at least some provisions of this bill. Because they're not winning over any hearts and minds with that legislation. And if they want to continue their dominance of the state, they might actually want to take stock of that. Anyway, Colorado is voting on paid family leave. I think that the issue of paid family leave is one that I think that Republicans might be wise to think about cutting spending elsewhere to pay for, because to me it just seems like a good idea to help families. I know it's another government-run program, and we shouldn't be expanding the role of government, but it's also a pro-life thing to do. And again, there is plenty of spending that we could cut elsewhere to pay for. We don't have to raise a single tax to pay for this. We could also allow people to divert their Social Security funds towards paid family leave. Florida is going to vote to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, that's not a guarantee that it will pass. It needs 60% in order to pass, in fact, because that's what the threshold for passing a measure in California is. But I honestly think that, much as the misgivings I have about the minimum wage, I personally think that a $15 an hour minimum wage at this point is inevitable. And think about this. In 2012, so in 2009 was the last time we had a minimum wage increase, when it went up to $7.25 an hour. Obama in 2012, I believe, campaigned in his re-election campaign on raising it to $9 an hour, I think, or 10 maybe. And then in 2016, Hillary Clinton ran to the left of him on that and said she wanted to raise it to $12 an hour. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's position is actually that he wants to raise it to $15 an hour. And honestly, I think this is probably going to be one of the most lasting impacts of the Sanders candidacy. Not Medicare for all, which is really languished in Congress, but rather a $15 an hour minimum wage really seems like it's now mainstream in the Democratic Party, but among both supporters and lawmakers. And so that, I think, just seems to be inevitable, including on the federal level, especially if Democrats take control of the Senate. So if conservatives want to block that, then maybe they want to support Republicans for the Senate and elsewhere down the ballot. I don't think there's a good reason to support Donald Trump, but you could very well support Republicans down the ballot because many of them are doing great things. You can quip about their support for Trump, and certainly I do, but at the end of the day, I think there's plenty of other good things that they're doing. Again, it depends on which congressman you have. You could have someone as awful as Steve King, or you could have someone as great as Will Hurd or Jamie Herrera Butler. And in my opinion, it doesn't. I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I personally don't think it's worth it to toss out every single Republican, because I think that some of them have been doing great work. Anyway, Illinois wants to is going to be voting on whether to institute a progressive income tax. Amazingly enough, they actually have a flat tax, and so they would be voting to institute progressive taxation. Now, I think that it should be clear where I stand. I personally think that taxes should be flat. You know, to me, everyone should be the same rate. But ideally, in my opinion, the ideal tax system, one that obviously won't happen in my lifetime, but in my opinion, it's the ideal system. It's one that taxes consumption rather than productivity, and incentivizes people to work and to save. And you can also make this progressive. If you could basically make it so that if the ultra rich were to spend their earnings on a luxury yacht or a limousine or a mansion, you could very well tax that at a high rate. But in my opinion, you shouldn't have a high tax on their earnings. You should tax it depending on how they spend it, and incentivize them to reinvest it in their businesses and to and in their workers. But that's just my opinion. Obviously, it's not going to happen. But to me, it seems like what Illinois is voting on could very well go the wrong way, in my opinion. Colorado will be moving the other way, the flat tax, and they'll be voting to cut it from 4.63% to 4.55%. To me, that sounds like a great way to go. And you might be wondering, well, isn't that going to create the deficit? No, it isn't. Colorado, like 49 of the 50 states, including Colorado, have a requirement that that budgets have to be balanced, including every state except Vermont has that requirement. Well, obviously every state except Vermont and the federal government. And we can talk about whether or not the federal government needs to have a balanced budget amendment. That is very much something I could very well support. And by the way, just an update. Joseph Kennedy is now back in the lead in Massachusetts, statewide, and we currently have results from Massachusetts' 4th congressional district, and Jake Auchincloss is currently out in the lead. And honestly, this is a very early results, but it's really interesting to see. Jesse Mermel, who I thought was the front runner, is down at 7.5%. This is just the very early results. But Jake Auchincloss was very much the front runner early on. But if this result holds, that'll be fascinating. That he's getting close to 30% of the vote in what was very much viewed as a potential 7-way race. And so that's just something that we have early on, just to keep an eye on. And Stephen Lynch is actually out to an early lead with 3/4 of the vote. And I will admit, I could very well have been wrong about this district. I really thought that Stephen Lynch was in real danger. He was not campaigning. He was letting some mailers from Robbie Goldstein go unanswered. And his performative questioning again at Louis DeJoy's hearing really sparked of desperation. And it really seemed it really did seem like he was in danger, and that there were things going on. That he was possibly even seeing polls suggesting that things were in danger. Like his own internals might have been suggesting that, and so I could very well have been wrong about this. It really is a difficult endeavor trying to gauge where a primary election is at when an incumbent faces a challenger. So I really did think, again, that Lynch was in danger, and I will admit that I could have been wrong about this. But anyway, that's just some early results we have to keep an eye on. And again, as of this moment, Joseph Kennedy has a very narrow lead over Ed Markey with about 8,550 votes in. Anyway, Nebraska is voting on a measure that would cap payday loan interest rates at 36%. Now, I have very mixed thoughts about the whole idea of payday lenders. And where I'm from in Canada, we actually do cap it at about 35%. I do think that payday lenders, as of right now, are a good way for, are at least a way for people to get back on their feet. And I worry that if we ban payday lenders altogether, that people will have fewer options, and people will have when they're in straits like that. But again, there are lenders that can charge close to 2,000%, and that to me just seems wrong. You know, so I personally think there's a middle ground. We could very well limit the rate that payday lenders could charge without banning them altogether, because people do rely on them, and that's just something that I think that people who talk about this issue really need to keep in mind. Now we do have another update. Joseph Kennedy has about a 4-point lead over Ed Markey. It's actually a lead of about 900 votes that Joseph Kennedy currently has right now. I honestly cannot say for sure where exactly this race is going, but this is where things stand. Richard Neal's lead over Alex Morris has also come down. It is now where it was actually at the start of the night. About 58% to 42%, give or take that. It's about a less than 500 vote lead right now, and so that's where things currently stand at this point in the night in those races. Now we've talked about the issue of drugs on the show before, but just to give a quick recap, Mississippi, South Dakota, and Nebraska are going to be voting on whether or not to either expand or legalize medicinal marijuana. In fact, Nebraska and South Dakota are two of the three remaining states that do not have a medicinal marijuana program. And so if they legalize it, that will leave Idaho as the only state in the country that does not have any medicinal marijuana program at all. And in addition to that, Montana, New Jersey, Arizona, and also South Dakota, which is voting on a second measure, will be voting to legalize recreational marijuana. And so far, 11 states have legalized recreational marijuana. However, I believe one of those states does not allow legal sales. It allows possession but not sales. I believe that would be Vermont, as well as Washington, D.C. But I think that's really where the trend is going. The trend towards legalizing substances that are not quote unquote harmful. I'm not entirely sure where the science is on this. I'm not entirely convinced that marijuana is not entirely harmful, especially if you're smoking at an early age. But that really seems to be where the trend is going, and I think that Republicans who try to stop it are really standing in front of a train that's hurtling towards where it's going to be anyway. Now, Oregon could be going even further, and will be voting whether or not to legalize magic mushrooms. Now, it's a similar quote unquote harmless substance that really seems like it could be the next marijuana. We'll see what ultimately comes of that. Now, I guess where I would like to stand is, I would, if the legalization movement says that we need to start legalizing actually harmful drugs like heroin, that is something I would very much oppose. I think many of us, know someone who is at some point struggled with opioid use. And when Canada legalized marijuana a couple years ago, I think that there was a missed opportunity where we could have legalized marijuana and taxed it, but also put more restrictions on the ability of doctors to prescribe opioids, because those things are deadly. And I think that most of us know someone who has struggled with them, and some of us have known someone who's died from them. Excuse me. But so I think that we need to where marijuana can be a treatment, we need to start having doctors prescribe that and not prescribe opioids. And so I think that's something that we could have done when we debated this issue, and we chose not to. And I think that we really should really talk about yes, moving towards legalization of substances that are harmless, but also more restrictions on things that are not. And so, if we're prepared to have that conversation, that would be very beneficial, not just to those, who want to, have fun and smoke pot, but for those who have really struggled with addiction and whose lives have turned upside down and whose families' lives have turned upside down because of their addictions. And nothing about fighting drug addiction is easy. It is really hard to stay clean. It is really hard to get clean. But we should the idea that our systems should be there to support those who are struggling should be the easy part, and there really should be the political will for you know making it so that people who are having fun don't get punished, but also being there for people who are really struggling with something that could kill them. And I don't think it has to be either or. We can do both of those things. And so that's where I really think that our drug policy should be based on, not penalization, but rehabilitation. Anyway, those are just my two cents on the whole drug issue. And not much has moved in the past few minutes. So I honestly think that I'm gonna cut the stream short at this point. But as of right now, Joseph Kennedy does have a lead over Ed Markey. But anyway, I encourage you all to tune in for Elections Daily Stream that's going on right now. They're streaming about this, and they're providing better analysis than I could possibly provide. I just wanted to provide my 2 cents on many of these issues that we've talked about tonight, as well as give as much updates as I can on the state of play in Massachusetts. In fact, as I'm saying that, it's just changed, and Joseph Kennedy's lead has come down again. It's about a 500 vote lead right now, with 25,000 votes in total. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. I really enjoy all those who tuned in tonight, and for those who will watch it later. And again, tune into Elections Daily Stream. They're doing a much better of this than I could possibly do. But again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you all another time.